everyone, and thank you, Brad. Brad and I go way back looking for toads together at Cape Cod National Seashore 20 plus years ago. So it's really exciting that he started this new organization, and I love the mission of making wildlife accessible. That's really near and dear to my heart as well. So I'm going to do the share screen thing, and hopefully it will work. Let's see here. All right. Are you seeing a large salamander on your screen? Is that working okay?
We are, yes, Brett.
Awesome. Great. So yeah, my name is Brett Thelen. I'm the science director at a nonprofit organization called the Harris Center for Conservation Education. We are based in Southwest New Hampshire, and we have a very similar mission to the Northeast Wildlife Team. Our mission is to help people fall in love with the natural world, and we do that through land protection in our small region. We've protected more than 26,000 acres of land for people and wildlife alike. Conservation research, including the community science project I'm going to talk to you about tonight, and then education for all ages, from babies in backpacks to residents of retirement communities and all points in between. I'm the science director, so I spend a lot of my time thinking about our community science projects, ways for everyday folks who maybe are not trained scientists to go out and help collect data that can be used for conservation decision making. And our kind of most popular and long-standing project is the Salamander Crossing Brigades. I have been coordinating this project. This will be my 19th year doing this project, I believe. So it's been a labor of love for me. And sometimes people around here might not know my name, but they know me as the Salamander Lady, and well, you'll see why. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the spring amphibian migration, which is not that far off, particularly for those of you in Rhode Island and Connecticut and Massachusetts. And that's what our Salamander Crossing Brigade project is focused on, this incredible phenomenon, which is sometimes known as Big Night. So I'll share a little bit about what that is, which species are out and about on these nights, and then a little bit about the issue of road mortality or roadkill, why it's such a grave conservation concern for amphibians, and then how our Salamander Brigade project is working to address this in Southwest New Hampshire. And we'll end with some ways that you can help, whether you live near our project or not. So we'll start with Big Night, which is this wonderful story that environmental educators love to tell, that, you know, after all the snow has melted and, you know, winter has finally loosed its grip and the soil has thawed, one day it starts to rain, and then all of the spotted salamanders and all of the wood frogs and all of the spring peepers on this one big night come up from underground where they've spent the winter and crawl or hop across the landscape on this one big night to vernal pools and other wetlands to breed. And this is the myth we call Big Night. And I always call it a myth because I've never seen it happen on just one night. Sometimes we have 2 or 3 big nights in a season and a few medium-sized nights and a small night here or there. The magic behind that myth is there. There are, on any given night, thousands and thousands of amphibians marching across the landscape on the first warm, rainy nights of early spring. But it's not limited to one night. So if you miss one, it doesn't mean you've missed it for the year. And the reason that it's spread out across many nights is that it's all weather dependent. And before I move on to what those weather conditions are, I love this photo. My friend Dave took this picture in upstate New York. This is a spotted salamander who has just emerged for the very first time after the long winter underground. You can see the mud is still caked to its face and its body. This is this salamander's first moment above ground for that spring, and I just love that he was able to capture that. So these amphibian migrations, the question that I get asked, you know, most often every spring is, when will the salamanders migrate? And I truly wish that I could tell you April 12th, put it on your calendar. Don't miss it. It'd make things a lot easier. But this is a weather-dependent phenomenon, and we're primarily looking for three things to come together. The first is thawed ground. So many of these amphibians spend their winter underground. So even if it feels like spring above ground, if the ground is still frozen, they won't get the message. So we need the ground to be thawed at least several inches for wood frogs and peepers and several feet for spotted salamanders. So in the early part of the season, this is what I'm looking for. The next is warm nighttime temperatures. So big night happens at night. It's a nocturnal phenomenon. And amphibians, as I'm sure you all know, are ectotherms. So their body temperature mirrors that of their surroundings. And so once it drops much below 40, it's pretty chilly for them and they're not moving too quick. So we're looking for nighttime temperatures 40 degrees and above. And then rain is the third element. And I always have a little asterisk there because all of these things have some level of variability in them. So if we've had a really long, warm, dry spring, wood frogs might migrate in just a heavy mist or a fog. They might not wait for a downpour. Or they might, be inclined to move, right around that 40-degree mark. There's lots of variability in all of these things. But a classic big night is 45 degrees and raining. And here in Southwest New Hampshire, that can happen anytime from early mid-March through early May. Those of you who are further south, Connecticut, Rhode Island, this could happen in February. Maybe not this year if you have snow on the ground like we do. But and for us, the early spring migration nights, we have 3 or sometimes 4 primary species, which I'll go through in a minute. But then the later into the season we get, the warmer it gets, the more amphibians are out and about. And some of them are breeding migrations, like American toads or gray tree frogs. Others are just foraging or dispersing, pickerel frogs, green frogs, bullfrogs. And then also salamanders of all sorts start to come out the warmer it is. So later in April and early May, we get a much greater diversity out there on the roads when we're out looking. But I'll just talk briefly about our kind of big 4. The first, of course, is the spotted salamander. This is the poster child for our whole project. They're quite distinctive. They have those bright yellow polka dots, and they can live 20 to 30 years if they are not hit by a car or picked off by a barred owl or something. They don't even start breeding until they're 2 to 5 years old. So it's really incredible. Sometimes we have young folks participating in our Salamander Brigades projects, and they may be holding an animal that is older than they are. They also have very charming smiles. They win the hearts of everyone who sees them. And I should also mention they spend 95% of those long lives underground. So these few nights a year when they're emerging to migrate is some of the only time that they spend above ground each year. And so it's really one of the best chances to see them. We also have, on our early spring nights, this beautiful frog, the wood frog. Their superpower is that they can freeze solid over winter. Their heart stops beating, their lungs stop breathing, and they just kind of wait in suspended animation. As a result, they don't have to overwinter as far below the ground as spotted salamanders do because spotted salamanders cannot survive freezing. So wood frogs are usually one of the very first to emerge in early spring. And when they get where they're going, the males start to sing. I'll play you a little sound clip of that. Hopefully you can hear it. And this picture is just for me to remind you about their superpower of freezing. They're quite cold tolerant. They're one of, I think they're the only frog that exists all the way up through Alaska and northern Canada. And then we also have a third amphibian early in the spring. I'll play the sound for you as well. You can tell me what this animal is, I'm sure, by hearing that sound. So that is our spring peeper. They are a very tiny frog. They have one of the largest sound volume to body mass ratios. So they're a really tiny frog that makes a really big noise. And they are also, here's some for scale to show you. They are also our most numerous spring migrating amphibian that we see at our sites. And then for us, a handful of our sites have a fourth species or group group of species. These are there's a salamander that is related to the spotted salamander called the Jefferson salamander, and another one that is the blue spotted salamander. And in places where they coexist, they hybridize. You can't tell from looking which one you've got. So we just assume that all of our Jefferson salamanders are probably Jefferson blue spotted hybrids. They have really complicated genetics. There's some all female lineages that don't incorporate they need sperm from the males to get their eggs developing, but they don't pass any of the male's DNA down through their line, which is really wild. And there's some studies that are showing that they are better at regenerating lost limbs than the lineages that aren't all female. So there's all kinds of amazing stuff with them. They are a species of conservation concern here in New Hampshire. They're much more closely tied to vernal pools, and so we don't have them at all of our sites. But at the sites where we do have them, they really also are fairly cold tolerant and come out early in the spring. So one of the other questions I get, of course, is like, why are these animals crossing roads? Why can't they go somewhere else? And it's a pretty simple thing. They spend most of their lives in the woods, in the upland. They breed in vernal pools and other wetlands. And so when there is a road between the woods and the wetlands, they have to cross that road in order to breed, in order to court and lay their eggs. And they have really strong site fidelity, which means that they're really attached to those breeding sites. They return to the same sites year after year. In many cases, it's the vernal pool or wetland where they themselves hatched. And so if you look at this spotted salamander that can live 20 or 30 years, every spring it's returning to that same site. And so it has to cross the road to get to the vernal pool. It has to cross the road to get back out of the vernal pool to the woods. So it's making at least 2 crossings each year. And then multiply that by 20 years. And you see that roads become a really significant part of their lives, whether they like it or not. And so just a few words about what that means for them. I think most people, when I ask you to imagine roadkill, or what animals do you think of when you think of roadkill? You can put some in the chat if you want. Most people tell me deer, raccoons, squirrels. So these are large-bodied animals whose when they get hit, they tend to get hit one at a time, and their bodies stay on the road for a long time. So we see them, we notice them. Amphibians, it's different. Amphibians are small, they're soft-bodied, they're active at night. So we don't see the problem the way that we might see it for other animals. But all of the research in road ecology is pointing to roadkill as a really significant conservation concern for reptiles and amphibians in particular. 95% of all vertebrate roadkill is reptiles and amphibians. And we don't see it because unless you're out there on these migration nights, by the time morning rolls around, the amphibian, they're either crushed beyond recognition and you're not seeing them, or they've been eaten, scavenged by crows or foxes or ravens. But if you're ever out there on these migration nights on roads, you will soon realize that when you have thousands of amphibians moving all at the same time, it does not take a lot of cars to do a lot of damage. So there was the study that really kind of opened my eyes to this whole thing was in Canada. They looked at a 2-mile stretch of road over the course of 4 seasons, and they documented 30,000 dead amphibians just on those 2 miles. Studies in New York and Vermont documented more than 50% mortality of salamanders that were attempting to cross paved rural roads. So think about that. Your best case scenario there is that only 1 out of every 2 are making it across. And another modeling, a study in Western Mass, said that they could lose their local population of spotted salamanders due just to road mortality within 25 years at even lower roadkill rates than that. So this is a really big deal for these amphibians, whether we see it or not. And not all roads are created equal here. It makes sense that roads near water are where much of this is happening. There are patterns on the landscape. So the salamanders and frogs are going back to the same places year after year. So patterns emerge in terms of their activity on the landscape, but also they're using wetland habitat. So roads near water have higher roadkill, both for reptiles and amphibians. So I'm mostly focused on frogs and salamanders, but there's also turtles and snakes out there. And traffic volume matters too. So a rural, if you think about like a dirt road with only a few houses, probably doesn't have enough traffic to make a huge difference. And places where there's highways, they probably lost their amphibian population a long time ago. But it's these paved rural roads, these kind of, middle ground roads where the most danger is happening, where the most damage is happening. And I always also like to include a little, what I call my so what slides about why amphibians matter, so that even if, roadkill isn't your thing to learn about, you can go forward and talk about the importance of amphibians. And one of the ways that biologists look at this is the concept of biomass. And so at its simplest, biomass is a calculation that you can make to compare one group of organisms with another group of organisms. And it's calculated by taking the mass of one individual of a given species in a given place at a given time, and adding that to all of the mass of all of the individuals of that species in that given place and given time. So at the Harris Center where I work, I often give the example that we could take the biomass of human beings in that building, and I'd take my mass and I'd add it to all the naturalists who work there, and I'd get a number. And maybe then I want to compare that to the biomass of mice in that building. We are based in a pretty old building with unfinished basement, and there's a lot of mice in there. So those numbers might surprise you, because mice are obviously smaller than humans, but they are much more numerous. And so there are some biologists who looked at this with just the one salamander species, the Hubbard Brook, at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in New Hampshire. They looked just at redback salamanders, which are a tiny salamander species. They're pinky sized. They're the ones you might see in your woodpile or under logs in the woods. And they found that the biomass of just that one species was greater than that of all the birds combined in their study area during peak bird breeding season. And actually, this is a seminal study that came out in the 70s. Modern research is showing that they may have underestimated how many redback salamanders there really are. So it's probably a greater figure than that. What does that mean? It means that there is a lot of energy moving through our woods and wetlands in the bodies of amphibians. And so that plays out most prominently in the food web. So they are important prey for herons and snakes and turtles and foxes and coyotes and owls, and you name it, it probably eats an amphibian. And they're also really important predators of invertebrates. So an American toad can eat 3 times its body weight in insects each day in the summer months. Spotted salamander larvae are voracious consumers of mosquito larvae and other invertebrates. And so they're really important link in this web. And if we were to lose them, there could be all kinds of cascading effects. And worldwide, amphibians are really in danger. This is a map that came out last year, 2 years ago now, the Global Amphibian Assessment. These colors are showing places where there are threatened and endangered amphibian species. So the red means that there are 50 to 60 endangered or threatened species of amphibians in those areas. So these are places that have more endangered amphibian species than we have non-endangered amphibian species in our neck of the woods. And of course, a lot of this is due to habitat loss, climate change, disease, pathogens. We're really lucky here in the Northeast in that our amphibians are still doing pretty well. We have 1 or 2 species that are considered, we don't have species that are considered globally threatened. We have a few that are locally needing some attention, but we have an opportunity here to keep our common species common. And so that's where the Salamander Crossing Brigade program comes in. This is a project that we modeled after the initially after the Bonnievale Environmental Education Center based in Brattleboro, Vermont. We've now been doing it, as I said, for about 20 years. And our goal, we have 3 goals with this project. The first is simply to reduce roadkill associated with the spring amphibian migration. I'll talk about how we do that in a minute. The second is to collect data on where these roadkill hotspots exist, where these migrations are happening, and in the hopes that that data can be used for land conservation projects or road improvements. I'll talk about that too. And then the third, because this is a community science project, so every year we are coordinating hundreds of volunteers who are going out and doing this. And each one of them, we hope, becomes an ambassador for amphibian conservation in their communities and is someone who is thinking about this now on rainy nights and who maybe is talking with their conservation commission about land protection projects and thinking about the role that amphibians play in their local ecosystems. So it's threefold, our goals. And I won't go into great detail about how the project works, but I will explain a little bit about how it works. We have an entire volunteer training for that, which I will invite you to in just a moment if you want to get into all the nitty-gritty details. But basically, the way that it works is interested volunteers or community scientists who want to join the salamander brigades. What they do, it's divided into 2 time periods: before the big nights and on the big nights. So before the big nights, they attend a volunteer training. Now we hold these on Zoom. I'll give you the dates and details for this year's training. All are welcome. You do not have to live in Southwest New Hampshire. A big piece of the training is talking about safety. We talk about amphibian ID. We talk about how the project works, how our communications work for that. Then, because we don't know exactly when these nights will happen, they stay on call. So folks are welcome to sign up for our email list. We send out emails when we think a migration is likely. We also post to social media. And in season, I keep a 5-day salamander forecast on the Harris Center website, front and center, so which I update daily during the salamander season. So you can come in and see, it's color-coded, red, yellow, green. You can kind of get a sense for what might be happening in the next few days. That's really geared towards Southwest New Hampshire because weather is so variable. Even within our region, it's variable. We will have migrations in Keene, which is low elevation, while it's still totally snowy in Peterborough, which is 25 minutes away, but higher elevation. And so because it is so site specific in terms of the weather, I can't predict across all of New England. So I'm only trying to predict for our neck of the woods. But so they're staying on call. They're watching the weather. They're watching our forecast. And then while they're doing that, they're also getting their field gear together. So safety is by far the most important thing. This is not an inherently safe activity to be out on roads at night where drivers might not expect you. And so field gear involves, most importantly, a reflective vest, bright lights, flashlights, headlamps, and of course, things like rain gear, because it will be raining when we're out there, and clipboards and data forms and all of that. So a lot of our longtime Salamander Brigade volunteers just keep kind of a salamander bag ready to go during the season. On the big nights, we move amphibians across the road in the direction that they were heading, mostly by hand. There are some sites that on some nights have such a high volume of amphibians that we have volunteers who prefer to use buckets to move a number of them across all at the same time. In the very beginning of the project, we called ourselves the Salamander Crossing Guards, but I rebranded because crossing guards stop traffic. And we do not stop traffic. It's not safe for us to do that. I don't think it's legal for us to do that. Our goal is simply to move the amphibians across the road faster than they can move themselves, and therefore to minimize their chance of coming into contact with a car. We also collect data, which is pretty simple. It's keeping count of how many we've moved across by species. We also count how many dead we have found by species, and then some really basic weather data and kind of other start time, end time, that sort of thing. Then they hopefully will report their data back to us through forms that we have on our website. Some people don't do this. They're just out there to move amphibians across the road. They don't want to bother with keeping count. But our hope is that, if you send your data in, then we can actually use it for other conservation outcomes. So I always encourage folks to send their data to us. And then the big, of course, thing that I talk about over and over again during our trainings is how to keep yourself safe. It is really, really important part of this project. So if this sounds interesting to you, whether you live in Southwest New Hampshire or not, you are cordially invited to attend our training. It's via Zoom on March 13th. You can register on the Harris Center website. We have many people who come from all over just to see what it's all about, just to learn more about the amphibian migration. And then some of them take that knowledge back to their communities. Some of them volunteer with us in our neck of the woods. It's just a fun night of looking at amphibian photos and thinking spring. So consider yourselves invited. And just some numbers just to look at the impact of this project over the years. The project started before my time in 2004. I came on in 2007. So this is when we started keeping better data in 2007. And so I have more figures for that. But since that time, we've trained, I think, 2,200 volunteers now. Many of them come back, just like the salamanders, year after year. It becomes a spring tradition for them. Some of them, move on to other areas and take this project with them. This is a crew from Keene State College, out and about for one of their first big nights. Thumbs up, even though it's cold and rainy. We always say that it's the first warm, rainy nights of the spring, but 43 degrees doesn't feel very warm when you've been standing out in it for 3 hours. At least unless you're a wood frog. Maybe it feels warm if you're a wood frog. We've now identified another part of our training is we know of a number of amphibian crossing sites. Some of them we have had volunteers or staff monitoring for years. But as the project got bigger and bigger, I started to hear from people further and further away who really wanted to join. And they said, I don't mind. I live 3 hours from Keene, but I don't mind driving. Like, I'll come. I want to come check this out. And I thought, this is all wrong. We should be driving as little as possible on these nights. And so, how many amphibians might you be accidentally hitting on your way to help other amphibians? And also, the weather is so variable. If you live 2 hours away, by the time you get to where we are, conditions might have changed and the migration might have slowed or stopped. And so we kind of decentralized and encouraged people to find crossing sites close to home. And we keep an online map of all the crossing sites that have been reported to us just for New Hampshire. We're a small place-based organization, so we can't really manage beyond those boundaries. But so far, more than 150 sites have been reported to us. This gives volunteers places to go in their own communities. And we've now helped more than 85,000 amphibians across the road. Some of these are probably the same, and I know some of these are the same individuals year after year. So think this is 85,000 crossings. It might not be 85,000 individual amphibians, but it's 85,000 chances to create the next generation of amphibians. And also the people part is important. This is can be a truly transformative experience for people. If you think about wildlife and humans and the news that we hear every day, we hear a lot about how we are harming the wild world, and a lot of really serious and sad consequences. And so to be able to interact with wildlife in a helping way is really powerful. And not only that, but to be able to see so close an animal that you might never have seen in your whole life, that you didn't even know existed, because the only time it came out above ground was when you were tucked away indoors. That is really moving. And spotted salamanders are truly, we care about all amphibians, but spotted salamanders capture people's hearts in a really amazing way. There's true joy that comes from participating in this project. And every year I hear from people who are amazed about how the world seems totally transformed on big nights, how it feels like magic out there, and how they just want to keep coming back. really amazing. I love this. Not much gets my teenage son out of the house, but Salamander Crossing does. Um, this is a really powerful way for people to participate in the world around them and kind of be heroes for a night. I do want to say a little bit about this, the science behind this, because every year I get asked, like, how are the salamanders doing? You know, what, with the assumption that somehow going out every year that we're able to kind of monitor salamander populations. And there are real limitations to the information that we collect. So one of which is that we basically tell people to come out if you can and stay as long as you like. So we have some sites that might have 1 or 2 people at them for 1 or 2 hours. And we have other sites where we can have 50 people in a night. And we have really consistent coverage, like every rainy night of every spring for 15 years. And so if you had the exact same number of people, the exact same number of salamanders, and you had 2 people at one site and 50 people at another, it goes to, reason that the site with 50 people is going to count more amphibians. They're going to have more people available to count. We also have years when all of our rain or most of our rain happens at 2 or 3 a.m. and the salamanders and frogs are moving and we are not out there awake to count them for the most part. So we might have those years, we might have really low counts, but it doesn't mean that that amphibians aren't doing well or that populations are dipping. It just means that we weren't awake at the same time. So there are real limits in terms of comparing site to site, year to year. And that is, that's part of a community science project. If we really wanted to know how many amphibians were crossing at a particular site, we would do what Brad and I tried to do one year at one of my sites, which is to dig in an erosion fence, it's called a pitfall array. So a fence that blocked any amphibian movement, and then we would dig little traps into the ground every so often. And so when the amphibians hit that fence, they walk along it until they fall into a trap, and then kind of highly caffeinated, underpaid graduate or undergraduate students check those traps as frequently as possible and let the amphibians out on the other side. And it's really labor intensive. It didn't work that well on a roadside setting because of the snow and ice at the early part of the season. And so that's not the kind of science that we're doing here. And I can't tell you about population trends, but it doesn't mean that the counts don't matter. And it doesn't mean that it's not science that can make a difference. And so one of my examples of that, this is one of these examples. This is North Lincoln Street in Keene, New Hampshire. It's one of our most popular amphibian crossing sites with humans. And a while ago now, in 2008, we noticed that an area on the side of the road had been cleared and the for sale sign came up. And it turns out that the local conservation commission in Keene was reviewing a permit application to put several houses into this site. And it was close enough to the wetland that was under their purview. And so they called me up. They had heard about our project and they said, what can you tell us about this site? How important is it? How does it compare to other sites for amphibians? And I said, well, I can't really tell you that. This was the early days of the project. And I said, I can't tell you that, but I can tell you that this happened to be April, that the other night, in about 4 hours, 25 volunteers were at that site. They moved 838 frogs across the road in that time, and all of those frogs were going onto that property. So 838 frogs in 4 hours, and 25 people who put their own comfort aside to ensure the safety of those frogs. Those numbers tell a story that words can't tell. What if I had just said there's a lot of frogs there? What's a lot? Is it 10? Is it 100? Is it 1,000? 838 in 4 hours. That's a powerful number. And in this case, the Conservation Commission thought about that and they said, this is not the right place for houses. And instead of approving the permit to build there, they purchased that land themselves as conservation land for the city of Keene because of its importance as a migratory amphibian pathway. This was our first really big conservation success with this project. So there's that. I also think about the road impacts themselves. Even with the land protected on either side of the road, these animals still have to cross the road. And we know that we can't carry every frog across every road. That is not a permanent solution to the problem of amphibian road mortality. However, before we can start to think about more permanent solutions, we need, which are things like tunnels, which are things like road closures. We need this data because it might not make sense to close a road for a site where there's 10 frogs a night. But a site with 1,000 frogs in a night, that's a different story. A site with rare species, that's a different story. And so that is our hope for this project, is that the data that we're collecting can help inform kind of more long-lasting conservation outcomes. And so our really next big success that we're really excited about was at that same North Lincoln Street site, 10 years after the land protection project, where we started working with the city of Keene to close that road completely to traffic on big nights. And it quickly became a community space where people came out to see the frogs and the salamanders, people who didn't feel comfortable necessarily volunteering on our project on roads where there's cars. So we've had babies and strollers and toddlers and elders who are moving a little more slowly and didn't want to be on a place where there were cars driving through. They all come out to see the frogs. And it's the only place in New Hampshire that I know of that is closing a road for amphibians. And it's been a real source of pride for the community. Just a little bit about why we chose that site. There's multiple crossing sites in Keene, like there's probably multiple crossing sites in everybody's town. We picked this one because it was the simplest detour. We could close the road completely, no homes were impacted, and it also had the largest number of amphibians. So it's just a little bit about what that site looks like. So they're crossing from a wooded park across North Lincoln Street into this case. It's not vernal pools. It's essentially a beaver wetland, which is why it's a froggier site than more frogs than salamanders at this particular site. And this is another close-up drone's eye view. On a typical night there, as I've said, we can have 25 volunteers or more. They'll move nearly 1,000 amphibians across a stretch of road that's just 1/10 of a mile long. So when we were making the case to the city of Keene, we also emphasized that this was a place where many families come. So even if they don't care that much about the amphibians, people do care about other people, and they wanted to make it a safe place for people to come and just see this magic. So this is just just to give you a sense of what it's like out there. The challenge with these road closures is that I have to decide when we close the road, and I have to make the decision by noon on a given day based on the available weather forecast at that time. And I don't always get it right. Sometimes the weather changes dramatically. And so in this case, the red is a night when we had a decent migration, but there was the road was open because I just wasn't sure about it. But you can just get a sense for this is like the 6 biggest nights in that season. March 31st, we had 1,300 peepers that we counted in 3 or 4 hours. So just to give you a sense for what's going on out there at that site. And I would say that the most important thing about any of the numbers I'm sharing with you is that they are underrepresentations of what's actually happening. So as I've said, there can be variable volunteer efforts. So the fewer people we have, the fewer counts we might have. These only represent early evening migration, before midnight, but amphibians will migrate all night long if conditions are right. And at sites where the road is open to traffic, sometimes our volunteers choose not to count the dead ones, either because they just would prefer not to look at them and think about it, which is okay, or because they're so focused on ferrying the living animals across the road that they just don't want to have time, they don't want to stop to count the dead. And so our roadkill numbers for sure are low, but all of our counts are low because we're not out there all the time. But even with that, if you look at the years where we did not have road closures and the years when we have had road closures, you can see that they are making a difference, that the percent mortality that we're recording, even just during the time when we are out there moving animals across the road, is significantly less during the years when we have road closures. And this accounts for those nights when I didn't get the call right and we left the road open and we maybe shouldn't have. So even when we have nights like that, it's still overall making a difference. So a few years ago, we expanded to a second site. This has fewer numbers of amphibians, but it has Jefferson salamanders. And so it is a priority because of that at-risk species. Unfortunately, at this site, there are a lot of homes there and there is no easy detour. And so we cannot close it completely. We can only close it to through traffic. But it's still an exciting development. And at that particular site, the most exciting development, we'll see what happens, is that starting last year, our state wildlife agency created a proposal to put in 4 herp tunnels in the state of New Hampshire, 3 focused on turtles in other parts of the state, and they wanted to do an amphibian tunnel. And they came to us because we had all these years of data and we had all these years of working with the city of Keene on the road closures. So he had already developed a really strong working relationship around conservation. And so they came to us and said, we want to do a tunnel project. That one, we picked the Jordan Road site, the second site, because of the presence of Jefferson salamanders. The funding proposal, the grant source wanted at-risk species. And we will see what happens. It was funded, but part of that funding was federal. So we are not sure yet if it will move forward. But even the fact that that state wildlife agencies are looking at the data collected by our volunteers and using that to think about long-term solutions is, to me, a huge win. It's just an incredible testament to what can happen when you get out there rainy night after rainy night. And I should say that this picture, it doesn't look very exciting, but it's very exciting to me because this picture is from an amphibian tunnel project in Moncton, Vermont. It took them 10 years to fundraise and design these tunnels. I think there are 2 or 3 tunnels. And they put in trail cams in the tunnels in order to monitor whether they were working or not and make any adjustments as needed. And this is the first spotted salamander to be recorded crossing under one of those tunnels in that first season that it was open. And that first season they recorded, I think, 2,200 amphibians using this tunnel. And the thing about the tunnels that is so great is that when we are doing this Salamander Brigade project, our involvement tends to end in early May. And so we don't catch the entirety of the amphibian migration, particularly the migration out of the wetlands, because that is not as concentrated. It tends to be more dispersed, and we can't be out there every rainy night through the summer, even though there might be amphibians there. And our project also doesn't capture the young of the year who are leaving the wetland in August or September. But tunnels are there all year round. Whether a person has accurately predicted the migration or not, whether people are out there or not, the tunnels are there and the amphibians can move under them. And so it's a really, this is like what you aspire to. Tunnels are also very expensive. And so, they're not appropriate for every single site, but in the places where they are appropriate, they can make a really, really huge difference. And we're excited to even be thinking about a tunnel project, even if it doesn't happen right now. It's a huge step forward for us. So I will just end this part with just a few ways that you can help, and then we can take some questions. So as I mentioned, if you live in New Hampshire, truly, you can come to our Salamander Brigade workshop from anywhere. Last year, I think we had people from 12 or 15 different states. If you want to actually volunteer with us, you have to live in New Hampshire for our project. Because as I said, you don't want to be driving far distances on these nights. So come to our workshop, learn. So you'll see some of the same pictures, but come learn, take it home with you to your community. We'll talk about, in addition to how our project works, we also talk about how to identify sites, new sites that in your communities, what to look for, that sort of thing. So join us if you like. We are not the only organization doing this. And so we also have a list on our website of other Crossing Brigade programs, everything from really data forward, well-developed, well-supported programs like North Branch Nature Center for you Burlington folks. North Branch Nature Center, which is based in Montpelier, they coordinate amphibian crossings throughout northern and central Vermont. They've got a really incredible program. We've got everything from well-developed programs like that to the Toad Detour, which is in Philadelphia. amazing. Near a reservoir there, they close a road for toads. Maine Big Night is really gaining traction. And then we also have really grassroots efforts that we list too. Maybe someone just wrote me and said, I really want to get this going in my town. If you hear of anyone who's interested, send them my way. And so we've got a list of people and projects in all throughout the Northeast, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts. And if you yourself decide to start one of these in your community, I'll add you to our list happily. And it's online. We update it pretty frequently. So check it out. And then the other message I would leave you with is, rainy nights are not for everyone. Some people go out one time, they think it's amazing, and they don't want to go out again because it's amazing and it's also cold and it's wet and it's dark. And some people are not nighttime people. And so what I always say is like one of the very best things that you can do to help amphibians is just don't drive on rainy spring nights or summer nights. Every rainy spring and summer night, there will be frogs and salamanders on roads near water, all night, all spring long, all summer long. And if your errand can wait till the morning, if you can go grocery shopping tomorrow instead of tonight, you could be saving the lives of dozens of amphibians just by staying home and being cozy. So that is a really great option too if you're not up for rain gear and reflective vests. So that is the end of what I have formally kind of prepared to share, but I hope that there are some questions. And I know that Brad maybe is moderating that, but if you have questions, now's a great time to put them in the chat. I can start to answer them if anyone has things to share. And Brad, I don't know if you want to, you're unmuting yourself, so you can kind of, do you want to moderate questions or what's the best way?
Whichever, yeah. If you want to read them out loud, or I can read them out loud and you can answer them.
Why don't you read them?
Okay, wonderful. So we have a question here. On a given stretch of road, is there a specific strategy for deciding what portion or part of the road to focus the ferrying work on?
That's a really good question. So there do tend to be concentrations that are geared towards either where the animals are coming from or where they're going. And so some of it is we don't really try to orchestrate very tightly like who should go exactly where on a road. It just would be too difficult, and it's more freeform than that. But we basically walk back and forth. We patrol with our flashlights, and if you find areas of the road that are where there's greater concentration, you just tend to stay there longer because there are more critters there. So some of it's predicted. You can predict these things through some GIS. Most of our sites have a wooded hillside on one side of the road and also a wetland or vernal pool on the other side of the road. So we can predict the general area, but once we're on there, we kind of tend to just look for them and move them when we find them.
Yep.
I do want to mention, here's a question that came in just to me in a direct message. So I'm going to read this one. Okay. If you aren't stopping traffic at most sites, and you're just moving salamanders across the road, wouldn't cars not have hit them anyway? So they're asking, like, is it really make a difference if they're crossing anyway? Wouldn't the greatest impact be stopping traffic, moving amphibians? Yes, that would be the greatest impact. It's also not something that we can legally do. It is not safe for us personally to get out. That we're volunteers. We're not like trained traffic people. I can tell you from being out there, I probably spend 10 to 12 nights every spring since 2007 out there. And I can tell you that these animals are not moving quickly. And sometimes they are stunned by the lights of oncoming cars. And so it is not a safe assumption that just because they can move across the road that they would be able to do it quickly enough to not be hit. Like that when you can see a noticeable difference when there are people moving them across the road versus when they are moving themselves. And they just don't move fast enough to compete against a car that's moving 25, 30, 40 miles an hour. Obviously, stopping traffic or closing the roads is the best thing, but it's just not practical or feasible or safe for us humans. So that's where um, that's why we focus right now on what is achievable, which is moving them by hand.
So another question is, does it hurt the amphibians to hold them with your bare hands?
Yeah, I get this question all the time. I will give two answers. My first kind of flippant answer is it hurts a lot less than a car tire. So anything that we might be doing with our hands is not as damaging to them as what is facing them in the road. But it's there's this myth that we have oils on our hands that can harm amphibians. And the reality is that it's not so much the oils on our hands, it's what we put on our hands. So if we have hand sanitizer or bug spray or perfume or lotion and we handle amphibians, yes, that can be harmful to them. So part of our training is talking about the importance of clean, wet hands, not using hand sanitizer. Now with diseases that are starting to kind of come on the scene with climate change and nitrile gloves are also a great option that some people use. But we also are handling them for a very short period of time. So we haven't seen any evidence that there's, for the brief moment it takes to kind of pick them up, move them across the road and put them down again, that there's any, that there's any significant harm to them. But nitrile gloves are an option for people who are really concerned about that.
So another question, you kind of touched on this, but it's a good one to talk about again. When getting transportation to a crossing site, how can you make sure you aren't harming amphibians on your way there?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is you might be harming amphibians on the way there. I certainly have hit amphibians on my way home from crossing sites. Sometimes it's hard to avoid when there are dozens, scores, hundreds of them on the road at one time. So, drive as little as possible, find a site as close to home as possible. Also, just take it really, really slow. If you are driving faster than 10 or 15 miles an hour, you're not going to see a spring peeper on the road. But if you are driving 5 or 10 miles an hour on stretches of the road that are near water, then you can develop a search image for them and you can see them and either avoid them or, on my way home, I always end up going to those keen crossing sites because we have so many people that come there and we feel like we need a real knowledgeable presence on site. And so I now live what is normally like a 20 to 25-minute drive from those crossings. And it takes me an hour or more to get home on migration nights because I'm stopping all the time to move animals across on my way home. So take it slow, try to avoid roads near water if you have an alternate route you can use, and just keep your eyes peeled. They don't always look like animals. Sometimes they look like sticks or stones in the road. So
Yeah, and I'll second and third that. I spent a lot of time as well doing road cruising, and even if the most trained eyes, right, they're just so small, a lot of these, the peepers, the redback salamanders blend in. It's just, even if you have the most trained eyes, they're hard or impossible to see in some circumstances. So I ditto what Brett says. The less you can drive, or if you do drive, try to stay on like super main roads that are heavily traveled where these populations have already probably been hit. And I'm just
yeah,
going to follow up, Brett, with a question, kind of when I go out and do this, we often will call the local police department to let them know.
yeah.
I wonder if you could maybe speak a little to that.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I do that too for some of our sites where we know there's going to be a number of volunteers, just to give them a heads up. These are public roadways, so you have a right to be there. But we have had a few times where police are concerned about our safety. And so I also would say, like, there are some roads where it's just not safe to do this. And it doesn't matter if you're wearing a reflective vest. You don't want to be doing this on a road where there's a 50-mile-per-hour speed limit or no lights or no shoulders, or, you have to really we spent some time looking at the safety aspects, even of just the nature of the road. And so you want to do that ideally in the daytime to just get a sense for it. So for your own safety, there's certain sites that are maybe more family friendly than others. There's other sites where I don't think anyone should be going if it's a 4-lane highway, even if there's still amphibians there. by some miracle. But yeah, thinking about safety, and also we do, if it's one or two people, I don't usually call, but if it's a group of you, it can be helpful to give them a heads up. They may even stop by and ask to see what you're doing and be curious about it. We've definitely had a lot of, and I also should say, I understand that my experience of police may be very different than other people's experience of police. And so you do what feels comfortable and safe for you. For me, I usually will give them a heads up if I think we're going to have a group of more than, say, 5 people or something at a particular site.
Yeah, and as kind of along that lines, and yeah, what you say about, having different experiences, right? Everyone has different experiences with the police. I've been very pleasantly surprised, or pleasantly just whenever I call in the different towns, there's been a very positive response. It's just like, oh wow, you're going, oh, and they often will stop by and they'll be interested, and it also helps to kind of, they may get calls from neighbors, right? That like
Yes.
there's a car driving really slow, or these people with flashlights out on the road. It helps to just give them a heads up so that, understandably people,
Yeah, people can get freaked out if you're in front of their house with a flashlight at night, or like for sure that can happen. So that's and that has happened to me where people have been really nervous by my presence on a road. So I think carefully about where I'm parking, where I'm shining my light, and you know, yes, and letting people know that you're going to be out there. Are there any other questions that we haven't gotten to yet?
I don't think so. Looks like we have. So I saw that Brett posted, you posted a few links there, and we'll on our website as well. I'll have Brett share with me any of these related links so you can get to them from our website as well.
Great.
And I will just also show like the number of times, I mean, especially spotted salamanders, right? Like when number of times people just stop and see you, doing something on the road, and they ask, what are you doing? And like if you show them a spotted salamander in your hand, I mean, I've had people come out that are like in a full four-piece suit and tie, just like
Oh yeah.
pull right off the side of the road, hop on, like
Yep.
it's just amazing what people what it does to people and brings community together, and yeah.
For sure. They'll melt your heart, and they really stop people in their tracks because people can't believe that something so beautiful and wild has been living in their backyard all this time and they didn't know it. So if you haven't yet seen a spotted salamander in real life and you're able to get out on these nights, I encourage you to check it out. It's a whole other world out there.
And before people hop off, I think people, if they haven't known you before, Brett, will see kind of why you are my conservation hero. Like if we ever find a new species of amphibian in the Northeast, I'm going to be the first in line to sign that petition to get it named after you. I really like, as someone who's only done a small amount of outdoor road cruising, the amount of like, yeah, go with all it is for, you said since 2007, 10 to 12 nights, rainy, they're cold nights when you're out there organizing all these people, 2,200 volunteers, 85,000 amphibians. I mean, it's amazing, Brett.
Wow.
It's uh,
Thank you. It's a group
so
effort.
fun.
Every one of those volunteers is making it happen. So, but thank you very much. And thanks everyone for coming out tonight. And maybe I'll see some of you in a month for our kind of more detailed amphibian training.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining.